Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks on H.R. 2543 and insert extraneous material thereon.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 2543, the Financial Services Racial Equity, Inclusion, and Economic Justice Act of 2022. Landmark legislation focused on promoting racial and economic justice. This bill was introduced by Financial Services Committee Chairwoman, the Honorable Maxine Waters, and it includes several provisions authored by members of the committee. Unfortunately, Chairwoman Waters couldn't be here today, but I would like the record to reflect not only her authorship of this bill, but also her unwavering commitment to achieving equity and inclusion on behalf of communities of color. Today's House consideration of H.R. 2543 is historic in that it, for the first time in our nation's history, the U.S. House of Representatives is voting on a comprehensive package of legislation to finally address inequity with equity and exclusion with inclusion in financial access, economic mobility, and fair treatment. Today, I boldly and proudly say that this would not have been possible without the Honorable Chairwoman Waters' leadership. This bill is needed because racial disparities in lending, home ownership, and wealth creation are all too real. For some, invidious discrimination, Mr. Speaker, is only a phrase. However, for too many others, it is a fact of life. According to the Brookings Institution, the racial wealth gap between white and black households is more than $10 trillion. The onerous wealth gap is perpetuated by the toleration of ongoing discrimination, redlining, and systemic barriers to accessing financial credit and services. Some of my colleagues across the aisle may say that the House shouldn't address this important issue. They may say that the House should ignore these very real, well-documented disparities and focus on getting inflation under control. To which I say, this bill deals with the very real inflationary pressures that people of color experience in their daily lives. Too often, Mr. Speaker, consumers and businesses from low-income communities and communities of color suffer invidious discrimination as they struggle to access capital and credit. Chairwoman Waters said it best, and I was there to hear her say it when she spoke before the Rules Committee this week. She noted that this type of discrimination is a form of inflation in communities of color. She indicated that when you add up inflated fees in tandem with inflated interest rates, simple loans cost more for people of color than others taking out the same loan in a different community. This, of course, assumes that you're lucky enough to qualify for the loan in the first place. And if you're not, then your options to build wealth are severely limited because you can't buy a home or start a small business. In fact, your only option for credit might be an inflated predatory payday loan that leaves you worse off, not better. This is inflation that people of color experience each day, and we should be just as outraged and concerned about these needlessly inflated high costs as we are about the general inflation we are experiencing during the pandemic. And I would further argue that addressing this form of inflation will bring down costs for everyone because, as my colleagues across the aisle are fond of saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. We also know that general inflation disproportionately hurts people of color, which is why this bill directs the Federal Reserve as it carries out its duties to rein inflation in and promote full employment, to also consider racial disparities so that all people will benefit from the Fed's dual mandate. Members of the LGBTQIA+ community also face discrimination in lending. This is why it leads to higher costs for them as well. We shouldn't stand for this during this time of year, but I'm pleased to be among those fighting for LGBTQIA+ justice during Pride Month. This is why H.R. 2543 includes my bill, H.R. 166, the Fair Lending for All Act, which furthers fair lending by clarifying that lending discrimination is prohibited not only on the basis of race, Mr. Speaker, but also on the basis of gender identity, sexual orientation, and geography. This bill enhances supervision and establishes criminal penalties for lending violations. Let's take a closer look at lending at this time, fair lending. Every person who purchases a home should be able to read and understand their mortgage documents. This is why common sense should prevail. However, that's not the reality for many home buyers in our country today. This is why the bill includes robust language to access the requirements for a mortgage, and these mortgage conditions should be made clear in languages that people understand. It requires servicers to expand and preserve the dream of home ownership for borrowers with limited English proficiency. Chairwoman Waters' bill will also support the efforts of Community Development Financial Institutions, or CDFIs, and Minority Depository Institutions, or MDIs, that fill a historic lending gap in underserved communities across this country. And it would mitigate banking deserts by allowing credit unions to serve areas that banks have ignored or abandoned. Moreover, this legislation includes another bill of mine, H.R. 2516, the Promoting Diversity and Inclusion in Banking Act, which would require federal banking regulators to evaluate policies and procedures banks and credit unions have to promote diversity and inclusion. I would like to thank Chairwoman Waters for her continued leadership, her bold leadership, as well as my colleagues and members of the Financial Services Committee for their tireless work, including Representatives Meeks, Cleaver, Beatty, Garcia of Texas, Torres, and Auchincloss. Mr. Speaker, the pandemic has exacerbated and exposed many truths about our nation's inequitable housing and financial systems, as well as its outsized impact on low-income families and communities of color. It is incumbent upon this Congress to finally address these disparities, and that is precisely what Chairwoman Waters' bill will do. Hence, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 2543, the Financial Services Racial Equity, Inclusion, and Economic Justice Act. And I reserve the balance of my time.